developer experience is something that's not often talked about, but I think is actually more critical than certain design patterns. So let's go ahead and talk about that. Hey you guys, Space Marine 658 here, and so like I said, the intro is this is probably one of the most critical skills you can have as a developer. And the reason for that is you're not only going to save yourself a lot of time and energy and effort, but you're also going to save yourself a lot of design issues. Now let's kind of talk about what is developer experience. Now here in these two examples I'm going to show you, I'm using Unreal Engine, but in general you can use sort of any engine to apply these same similar processes. But the idea is developer experience is how you as a developer interact with the tools and functions and code that you have written. Now, I'm going to show you two different functions here that both do the exact same thing, but look very, very different. So let's go ahead and hop into our game here. So we've got these two functions. So let's do update objective and turn off the context because we don't care about that. So we have update objective tagged and then update objective tagged old. So we've got these two different functions here, right? For all intents and purposes, they do the same thing, right? I have added it here at the end of this function for a different purpose. But let's go ahead and make a objective details. Now, functionally, I don't use the display name anywhere, so otherwise everything is basically identical. But as you can see, these are vastly different functions in terms of how you interact with them. Now, there are times when you only need maybe a variable or two to pass into a function. If you're looking at a very simple function, something where, for example, this update objective one, I've got a much simpler version that literally just takes in a Boolean and an F vector, something like that. You could probably get away with not actually, doing anything too complicated with it because it's a very simple function. But as your function starts to grow, you start to add new things. For example, adding what tags you want to add, what tags might be needed to complete this objective, a timer, distance for the player, distance for trigger. You start to gather a lot of functions, and that should be triggering in your head like something's not right here, right? This is not a simple function anymore. How can I handle this function in a more simple way? Well, if we look at this example, right? This function is actually not a blueprint callable. Just for you who are not Unreal developers, basically this is a type of function that lets us call it slightly differently. But basically what's happening here is with this blueprint callable, this is only defined inside of C++. Versus this native event, I can actually do a sort of mixture of the two, right? But by making it simplified, I can actually use only what I actually need. So let's go look at that function. So since this one is implemented in C++ as basically just doing these pieces here in C++, these are the most expensive portions, or in this case, I think it's not necessarily that it's expensive. These are just the things that it looks a lot cleaner if I do these inside of C++. And some of the stuff that I need to access in this details are actually blueprint specific kind of structures and tags and things like that I don't want to have to rewrite into C++. But as you can see, simply by changing and turning all of these functions parameters, all these input parameters into a single struct, I basically simplified a lot of the work in that, one, I can save this struct as a variable. I can keep it as somewhere stored. I could have an array of these. If you have instance structs, you can actually have a variety of different types of structs. So for example, right, if I go ahead and go to my quest system, I have been building a few different objectives over here, right? For now, these are just singular objectives that are basically what I'm using to test out the system. But in theory, With something like instance structs, a free plugin that's just included as part of Unreal Engine, but I believe Unity has a very similar style setup. What you can do is you can actually combine different structs. So I see you have an instance struct, and then if I compile it, what it lets you do is you can then select what struct you want to have instance, and if you make it an array, you can actually mix those different structs together. So, right, let's say the first struct is of that objective details, but let's say the next one isn't. It's a the other one was st object details, yeah, st quest objectives, and I can mix and match these all I want. But the benefit of having them be wrapped up inside of this struct is that when I'm using the function that I have now simplified, it's significantly easier to just pass in those structs. Now, that's not the only example I have here today, but that is one of the most simple examples, right? That is something that's very clear as a developer. You're like, oh yeah, just wrap all of my variables inside of a struct. I can then simplify it, because one, then you don't have to store all those variables, because if you didn't do that, you'd need to either have them written only in the node. So if you change anything, you could risk wiping that actual value. Or you're going to have like 10 different variables stored for each instance of that function you want to call, right? Both of those are very bad options versus wrapping them in a struct. Allows you to simply just pass them on to the function. It lets you store them. It's very simple. You can always expand the struct at a later time if needed, especially when it's a C++ struct. It's a lot easier. If I go look at my helper class, right? It's a lot easier to extend this struct now that I've written it in C++. And given a very simple way to handle it. I can add, as you see here, tool tips for each one of those different things. It's very flexible and extendable. Let's go take a look at another example I have here. This is something I wrote a long time ago when I was specifically trying to wrap it in a macro library. I just wanted a very simple, input is this gamepad key. And then if so, it goes and looks at all the different gamepad buttons. If not, it goes and looks at all the keyboard buttons. And then it goes and finds the correct object reference and basically assigns it back to the key icon. Now, while this in and of itself works, and it's definitely used in a lot of places, this is a very hard to maintain kind of code. Now, this is kind of a set it and forget it kind of code, because most of the time these kind of texts don't change. You're not going to see a keyboard A key change to something different. But let's say it does. Let's say I start adding localization to my game. Suddenly maybe this key is not actually A. What key is returning? Well, if I want to support those other keys, it's a lot harder to come in here and start adding those keys in here and extending this further and further. Versus, let's go take a look at what I've been reworking this code as. Basically, this is that exact same big old jumble of spaghetti code simplified. So what happens in this function, right, is instead of coming into this macro library, right, instead of hitting this function, set key texture all, where it goes in, it gets the key, which is a string. It grabs the current object reference to a 2D object, texture 2D object, and is it a gamepad key? And it goes through all these switches and tries to go through, which are relatively performant, because switches aren't necessarily like the worst thing in the world. They're not necessarily great, but they're not the worst either. They're definitely relatively optimized considering how Unreal Engine works. But it goes through. But the thing is with this is, even though it is from a coding perspective relatively performant, it is from a developer experience perspective very awful. It's almost impossible to tell where things are going. It's hard to read the whole graph at once. There's just so much going on. Versus, boom, that's it. I'm getting that same string. I'm going and looking for the key images for that string. Because, if you look at the macro library, right, I actually don't know that I need the isGamepad key. In theory, these two switches could be combined into one switch, but I split them because as a developer, it's a lot easier to read this if they're split. But even then, it's still a pain in the butt to read. But with our function here, it's much simpler because it's all coming from this key images. So if we go look at our map, right? Now this is very short because I've not filled out all the details, but it's a lot easier to read through this. You can actually see one-to-one. This is the A character going to the A key, B character going to B key. You can actually see those because they're right next to each other. Rather than over here, you have to go, okay, gamepad, D-pad up, what image is that going to? And you got to make sure you don't lose track of where you're following. Oh, okay, it goes to this one. Well, what does that look like? Well, you can't see that here. You have to actually click on browse and then go here, and then you can see it. Versus in the new version, right? It's right there. It's right next to it. And the cool thing is, by doing it this way, I can actually make these soft object references to these texture 2Ds. So these don't actually get loaded up until it goes to try and pull one of these. So it'll go, okay, I need the key for, button A. I don't know if that's loaded. Let me go grab it. It's going to try and load the asset blocking. If it's already loaded, this basically just gets skipped to go straight to the next step. But if not, then it loads in that asset, and then it grabs a cast to texture 2D. You have to do this because this just returns it as object reference. I could, in theory, pass this back as a generic object, but because I'm going to be using this in places where I know that I want a texture 2D, I just convert it beforehand, because then I don't have to do this on every single time I want to call this function. It's just right here in the function, and a cast is very cheap when you're casting to the actual top level class. Because you're not actually loading that into memory, because of course there's going to be texture 2D somewhere in your game loaded, so you're not really worried about loading in texture 2Ds. And then the cool thing is, if I don't find it, it'll go false and return this warning, when before it would have to go search through all the switches, and then if it didn't find any of these matched, then it would go to default, and then it would go to the setting the warning as the texture, right? And functionally, from a performance standpoint, these are basically identical, or at least very similar. I think technically the find might be slightly slower, depending on your implementation and stuff. I think this will be probably slower, but not by enough to actually make a difference. But what it is significantly faster from a developer experience. If you're a solo on a project, maybe it's not as important, but especially as you get to be 2, 3, 4 people, looking at this code is extremely easy to read and see what it does. Get image takes in a string key, looks in the key images, searching for one of these. When it finds it, if it does find it, it returns that image. If not, it returns a warning. Very simple, very straightforward. Anyone can read that. Versus this is kind of a giant mess. There's a lot harder to read, a lot harder to see. If you're trying to follow along, I mean, you can kind of get the idea pretty quickly. You can grok the idea, you can understand it. But why go through all of this, especially when to add anything, right? Let's say I want to add a new key. I'd have to go add pin, and then have to go into this switch statement, add whatever the new case is, and then from there, drag it out and hit the sit texture 2D, drag the pin all the way back here to the key icon texture. Or I guess technically I have a reroute node here. Then I'd have to go through the values, search and find the right one. Probably have to type it in, I'm looking for the T underscore, blah, blah, blah. Go find the correct one, set it, and then run the output out to here. Versus adding a new line in here is way simpler. It's hit the plus, enter what key I want, and then do that same search. So T underscore F and underscore, there we go, and done. That's it. It's as simple as that. I don't need to add any more run reroute nodes, need to move any execution pins. It's just add another string here and I can keep going. And even if I wanted to simplify it further, right? If I wanted to split this key images into 2 different ones, say keyboard key images and gamepad key images, I could also do that. And if I wanted to localize this, right? So if I wanted to try and pull, special characters for different languages, relatively straightforward and easy to do. A lot easier than in the other example. And that at its core is sort of what developer experience is. You're not necessarily going to outright save any kind of performance. There are times when that, refactoring your code to make your developer experience better can save you performance, but that's not the end goal of developer experience. The end goal is to make your life easier so that when you're coding, things are faster. It doesn't take you as long to do things. It's building these little tools and little shortcuts into your functions to simplify the process for you as a developer. It's sort of the flip side of UX, which is user experience, right? When you're talking about UX, you're talking about simplifying things for players, making things easier for players to get to places, to see things, making things clear to players. Developer experience follows a lot of those same principles, but for you as a developer rather than a player. So DX principles are going to be a little bit different from UX principles, but the general idea is the same. You want to make things more digestible, more understandable, and more easily accessible for you as the developer. But yeah, I think that is everything at the moment. If you definitely would like to see more, let me know in the comments below. I plan on doing another episode of our converting blueprints to C++, but stepping up into the bit more advanced section. But otherwise, I think that's everything for today. So good luck and good hunting.